Attendees are logged in now, and appreciate everybody joining us today. So I just want to welcome everybody, both participants and our panelists today. What we're going to do is we're going to have like a fireside chat style discussion today. We kind of thought it would be interesting to talk about CMMC from a number of different perspectives. So we've got a legal perspective, we've got a compliance perspective, we've got a technology perspective, and we're just going to have a discussion with three folks. Please feel free if you have questions along the way. There's a Q&A tab in the webinar. You feel free to throw questions in there. We'll try to hit those as we go, and then we'll save a little bit of time at the end to hit some questions that folks might have in the Q&A. We are going to be recording. We're recording now the webinar to be able to share later on. So just as a caveat that folks know that. And then I'm going to have launch a few little polls as we go. Once we get started, I'll launch the first one. For the attendees, if you could, participate and let us know what you think about some of those things, we'd appreciate it moving forward. I think now we'll just kind of let's go through and have the panels introduce themselves. We'll start with Brian and Jason. We'll come back to me as the final. So Brian, you want to go ahead?
Sure, no problem. Good morning. Thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate the invite to be here today and to share a little bit of information about CMMC. So my name is Brian Gunther. I'm the founder and president of Exceed Cyber and Compliance. And so as the name implies, we help organizations, including defense contractors and other government contractors and other regulated businesses, identify their compliance needs as it revolves around cybersecurity. That's where we focus.
Great. Jason?
Yeah, again, thanks, Jeremy, for having me. I am a government contracts attorney, and I help government contractors solve their legal problems. I work at Cordatus. It's a small firm, boutique firm located in Arlington, Virginia, and we focus on government contracts, bid protests, claims, REAs, also compliance issues, right? And CMMC is one of those big things that's coming up. And so I was happy to, when Jeremy and Brian asked me to join, I was happy to do so. And hopefully we can answer some of your questions in this area.
Great, thanks, guys. And I'm Jeremy Fremin. I'm here at RackTop. I'm EVP of our federal program, so I focus, pretty much exclusively on larger programs that take some time to develop and customize our solutions for different DoD, Intel, and federal civilian agencies for some of their use cases. So happy to participate. Looking forward to a fun conversation and seeing where we go and what we can learn from one another about CMMC today. So why don't we get started with, Brian, the community's been talking about CMMC for a long time. I've been in this space for a while, and I know it's gone through a number of different machinations and, false starts, maybe even a couple of times. But maybe you could help us, kind of help us understand how we got here, where we are, and kind of where we might be going in the short term. Can you kind of give us a sense there?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So for those viewers out there, I want to start off, I'll share my screen in just a moment to share a graphic, kind of show the timeline of how CMMC has progressed and how we ended up here, right? But the first thing I think it's important to reference or talk about for those who may be new to this topic or uninitiated, what is CMMC anyway? So high level is that CMMC stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And what that means is that effectively defense contractors at this point, this could expand to other agencies down the road, but at this point, defense contractors must protect data that the government, in this case, the DoD, considers sensitive. Whether it's FCI, federal contract information, or COI, controlled unclassified information, they care about that data being protected. And so this is really where this all started, is that the Inspector General in 2019 did an investigation across the defense industrial base and did a kind of a spot check and found out that these regulations weren't being followed. So that's why CMMC came to pass. So to give you a little bit of a background here, I'm going to share my screen real quick. I'm going to share this graphic. Jeremy, would you please tell me if you can see that graphic?
I can. You're good.
Okay, perfect. So let's start with going back 20-something years, right? So after the terror attacks of 9/11, there was a Congress commissioned a report that took about 3 years to complete, almost 3 years to complete, and that was released in 2004. And that report indicated in no uncertain terms that one of the reasons that these attacks were so effective, against our country, right, was because of the interagency communications being effectively sometimes non-existent or very poor. So these attacks really could have been mitigated if there had been better communications. Of course, one thing that came out of 9/11 was the formation of the consolidation behind DHS, Department of Homeland Security. But the fact of the matter is that where they saw communication breakdown between different agencies. And that's where it started with the 9/11 Commission report and revealing that to the public and to the government at large. Then fast forward to 2005 to 2009. These are pretty big ones. These are really, really chunky. Consider these effectively cybersecurity and control frameworks, NIST 800-53. So NIST is National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is part of the Department of Commerce. And they create, as the name would imply, standards. In this case, they created a massive standard for how to control data on federal systems. Again, those are government systems, right? And that's a really, really huge standard around cybersecurity and controlling data and access. Then this NIST 800-171, special publication 800-171, is a much smaller subset of that. And that is really about safeguarding controlled unclassified information on non-federal systems, so contractor systems, to clarify. So those being created and then sort of developed and ultimately rolled out was a big piece of this journey. 2010, the president signed an executive order identifying and making sure that CUI, controlled unclassified information, was going to be protected across all federal agencies, defining it and then saying it must be protected. Okay, and so that was created as well. And the U.S. Archives and National Archives also has a classification structure around that and how they define certain CUI. Then 2016-17, in the middle there, you see the finalization of a DFAR 7012 mandate. Now, what does that mean? Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, DFAR 7012. That was the rollout of effectively this NIST 800-171 framework to protect CUI, or safeguarding sensitive information the government deems critical, right? And they started including this in contracts. You probably have heard about this, right? If you're in the government space, you've heard about DFAR 7012. This means your organization, if you have CUI, you have to implement these 110 practices or controls outlined in NIST 800-171. Not insignificant. But again, we talked about earlier, I mentioned that the DoD IG Inspector General found that a couple years later, hey, wait a second, this isn't contracts, this isn't being done. This is where CMMC comes into play. CMMC as a framework, a framework is effectively enforcing and making sure that you implement the DFAR 7012 requirements and that you prove that. Okay. More on that a little bit later. So then in 2021, we had this changeover from CMMC version 1.0 to 2.0. It went from 5 maturity levels down to 3, so those are shrinking. And now we're in 2024. So we're at about the finalization stage of the rule, what's called the final proposed rule, called CFR Title 32. And that means that this new mandate is about to take effect. I mean, with any day, the final rule is going to drop. Congress has a 60-day approval window, and then it's done. It's final. And then next year, Title 48 means it'll be included in DoD contracts. So the requirement to comply will be included. And after that, it goes into a 7-year rollout period and auditing thereafter. So I know that's a lot. It's a lot to take in, but knowing the history is probably going to be fairly helpful for our audience today.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's a good catalyst. I'm going to throw up our first poll while we kind of transition to the next question, really about preparation. Given all of that information, how prepared do you feel like you are at this point? Understanding those compliance issues, and then I kind of pivot immediately to the legal issues. I know we've heard, many of us have heard about Penn State's issues up at ARL, and then Georgia Tech's issues recently at their lab. Related to these sorts of compliance and security issues. Jason, can you give us a sense of, how serious is this for companies, and, what kind of concerns do they have on the legal side and the ramifications of not living up to what they're committing to?
Yeah, it needs to be taken seriously. And I think the starting point for all this, as kind of Brian alluded to, is what's in your contract, right? And if you have DFARS, it's 252.204-7012, just easier to call it 7012. If that's in your contract, you're supposed to be providing adequate security, which means at a minimum, the NIST Special Publication 800-171, 110 requirements. So the legal ramifications of not doing so can be quite disastrous. And I'm not trying to, be hyperbolic about this. If you were at Georgia Tech and there's this lawsuit out there, it's done under what's called the False Claims Act. And so the False Claims Act is an old law back from the Civil War era, where it was intended to, when during the Civil War, Congress passed this, said, hey, we think some of these suppliers to, the military, kind of were price gouging and doing all sorts of bad stuff and causing, committing fraud. So they created this statute. And in that statute, it allows for the government to go directly after someone if the government knows, but it also has a carve out for a whistleblower provision. And this is what's happened at Penn State and Georgia Tech. So whistleblowers said, hey, we don't think, I should say they allege, we don't think that that these institutions have followed the cybersecurity requirements per the contracts that they have with the Department of Defense. And they're incentivized to do this, right? They're incentivized to do this because they can share in some of the damages that the government receives if the government goes through and prosecutes this case. So this is where you're seeing that. And what's interesting in both of these cases, the Penn State and the Georgia Tech case, both of them were employees or former employees of these universities. And like in their cybersecurity departments or in their information technology departments saying, you guys aren't doing what you're supposed to do. And apparently they were either pushed aside or something. We can read these complaints and see a little bit more about that. But ultimately, they go to a firm out there. There's other law firms out there that specialize in helping whistleblowers, called a relator under the False Claims Act, take these cases to court. And what you want to have, what the relator wants, these whistleblowers, is they want to say, hey, I'm bringing this, and if the government accepts this case and joins in on this case, there's a lot of power that the federal government has in order to get settlements, in order to prosecute these cases, and to get damages. And under the False Claims Act, whatever, let's say you put in an invoice for $10,000. If it was a false claim, the government can come back and say, we want triple that back, right? So it's treble damages. So instead of just getting the $10,000 back for the fraud, they would ask for $30,000 back. So seeing that, you can see when, and like in the Georgia Tech case, they mentioned hundreds of contracts in the complaint. So thus, that could be quite a significant sum. Now, there's the False Claims Act issues, right? If you're not doing what you're supposed to do with your cybersecurity compliance, because if you're signing an invoice saying I've done everything I'm supposed to do under the contract in order to get paid, and one of those things is cybersecurity, and you didn't do it, there's a possibility the government could be like, hey, that was fraudulent, and because you asked for money, it's a false claim, and they go through that process. But also, if you're not complying with that, you could lose your contract. I think if in the current final rule that's put out, like a contracting officer is not allowed to give you a new contract, extend a contract, give you an option, or do anything if you're not in compliance. So you could lose your contract that you have. Number two, they could also terminate you, right? So they could say, hey, you don't have this. Instead of waiting for the contract to end, they could terminate you for non-compliance. And that would be either a termination for cause under a commercial item contract or a termination for default. And that could be a significant blow to your company because that gets reported. You get bad, it's in FAPIS, so you get this bad mark. It's in sam.gov that says these people were terminated for a bad reason. This company was terminated for a bad reason. And so there's a lot of reasons why this needs to be paid attention to. The False Claims Act liability, the ability to get a contract, keep a contract, termination possibility, and then of course, if it's pretty egregious, there's also the possibility of debarment, right, from federal government contracting. So
which would affect all of your other contracts as well, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there could be a domino effect because if the DoD finds, for example, you're not following cybersecurity requirements, other agencies, other people will be like, yeah, these aren't people we want to mess. I mean, at a minimum, you might get a bad CPAR that talks about this, and that could destroy your past performance. And so your ability to gain new contracts in the future could be, damaged.
So that's interesting. So my last role before I joined RackTops, this has been a few years ago now. Yeah, I was the CEO of a small analytics firm, and so the things that Brian talks about in the compliance piece and frankly the complexity of it, right, was a little bit daunting. But quickly you understand as a CEO that Jason, the things you talked about, the potential implications of these things could be incredibly damaging. And so one of the first things I did in that role was to really look at our IT systems, as a small business, right? We were, 25, 35 people at the time, right? We didn't have an IT staff, right? We were outsourcing some of our stuff. We did have an on-site, small, we'll call it a data center, but it was, a closet with inadequate heating and cool or inadequate cooling, plenty of heating, by the way. Right. So we had, an on-site SAN, and I was very concerned with, what are we going to do about making sure that we have an ability to protect CUI information? Because, a lot of times, at least in my, further past, we sort of said, okay, our mitigation to this is that we're just not going to hold any CUI information. Right. But now it's almost impossible to do that. You get emails from other contractors, from the government, right, unsolicited with, tagged as CUI. So you're now responsible for managing and dealing with that information. And so looking at those from a technology perspective, and as a technologist, I was like, this is daunting, right? It's a triple digit number of requirements that I've got to deal with. I don't necessarily understand all of them. And the expense related with a small business to go through and implement those technology solutions to me was challenging from a budgetary perspective, but also from and understanding the legal and compliance requirements. So, here at RackTop, we really focus on, data security and, our heritage. And it's not a big sales pitch about us, but right, our heritage is going back to, our founders being in the national security space and really wanting to protect data, from adversaries. But with that, we do have the ability to, put in place AI tools that are, both doing active defense and behavior analytics on what's happening in the data, on the data plane, but also be able to quickly audit and manage what's happening with the data over time, right? And so who has access to what is an interesting question, but a more important question oftentimes is who has actually accessed things, right? And so when you get to a data spillage, right, you get to, where is your CUI data enclaved? How are you managing it? How are you ensuring that it's not being accessed by the wrong people at the wrong time, even accidentally, not just maliciously, right? Some of those things are put into place kind of out of the box. And I think those are some of the easier first steps with technology implementation that people can go down as they're looking at how to implement some of these compliance requirements, and then, taking that security in depth sort of approach where you have layered security features and other technologies to protect, multi-factor authentication and, network segmentation, all those sorts of things are all important, but they are, not adequate to hit all of the requirements in those things. So that kind of brings me to kind of a question back to you, Brian, around, the different levels of CMMC. I know there are different, different aspects of CMMC that people have to account for if you're level 1, level 3, the different pieces. Can you help us, how can an organization determine which level they need to be at? And then, what are the difference between them kind of in general?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a really important piece, right? So first of all, and Jason kind of alluded to this before, and I mentioned it earlier as well, which is it's all about the contract. Let's start there, right? What do your contracts stipulate? What do they say? What are the clauses in there? It's an important piece to understand that when you're dealing with the federal government, the contract is everything. It tells you what you have to do, what you can't do, and sometimes you have requirements that are included by reference. So, for example, you may have this DFARS 25204-7012, again, commonly abbreviated 7012 clause in your contract, but it doesn't say what it is. It just says you have to abide by this. Therefore, guess what? You have to abide by that as well. And so, it's very important to understand that before you sign a contract, know what it says. Know what it says, know what it means, know what the impact is. The contract is where you want to start understanding, especially with CMMC, what information and data you need to safeguard and how deep you need to go to make that happen to protect the government's data. All right. So if you haven't done this before, let's say you're new to this conversation, because I want to speak to all levels of capabilities and awareness of folks on the call today. do yourself a favor, go through your contracts, any of your task orders, right? Whether you're a prime or a sub, if you're a tier 1, 2, or 3 sub, doesn't matter. Those rules all flow down from the top all the way down to the lowest tier, to the end of the road. So talking about the actual compliance requirements around different maturity levels, which is what CMMC called it, maturity level 1, 2, and 3. Okay. And those levels, think of it as almost like stackable Lego blocks, right? We all probably, either we did or our kids play with Legos when they were younger, right? So think of like these different maturity levels. So maturity level 1 is called basic cyber hygiene, right? You got to put in basic protections, and that's under the 5220421 FAR clause, for example. If you want to play back the recording, look that one up, right? Those are the 15 basic cyber hygiene protect basic data. That's the safeguard for federal contract information, or FCI, right? That's about protecting the information in your contracts. So that's akin to maturity level 1, right? Now we're going to stack on top. That's 15, or really in CMMC maturity level 1, it's 17 controls, but it's around the same, all right? So think of maturity level 1. Then we stack number 2 on top of that. Now, number 2 is not another 15. Hold on to your seats. It's another 86. Sorry, it's another 96. I'm sorry. So you go from 17 to 110. Okay. Now that lift is massive because you're now at maturity level 2, have to protect 110, have to implement 110 what are called security practices, all of which have subcomponents. It's a big lift. I'm not going to lie. All right. So that's number 2. Then you stack on top of that. And that again, to be clear, maturity level 2, you have to protect CUI. And CUI is all about classification and marking of documents. What does your contract state? What type of CUI you're getting? That's the big question too. Got to ask yourself that. And you got to be very clear about the government, the data you get from the government and what you're producing and how you store, process, or transmit that data. Then last but not least, maturity level 3 is only expected to apply to certain, let's say, prime contractors that are a higher level. A very, very small percentage, only 1% of certifications are expected to be a maturity level 3. And that adds another 24 practices or security practices to protect the confidentiality. And that's what the government cares about, confidentiality of their data. It's not about availability or even integrity. They want to be sure you're protecting the confidential nature of that data.
From an access perspective, both internally and externally, correct?
Absolutely. Whoever can access it, that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
But those are the 3 levels.
Yeah. So Jason, this sounds, level 1 doesn't sound so bad. Level 2 starts to, make your head hurt a little bit. What are the legal expectations? I mean, these clauses have been in contracts for quite some time now. What are the legal expectations for companies for implementation of these things? I mean, how long are people going to get to, once they say go, to actually get to compliance? And then what are the ramifications if they're not there?
Sure. I mean, I'll fast forward a little bit because we have some final rules that aren't, final proposed rules that aren't out there yet. But I think one thing to consider here is when these rules do come into place, and as Brian showed in his graph, it's coming soon. No one can put a pin on it. It's going to be on this exact day, but we know it's coming soon. People are estimating March of 25, but it could be sooner than that. It could be a little bit later than that. We don't know. But one of the issues is, okay, getting a new contract. The government's it says at the time of award, you're supposed to be in compliance with this. So if you go through, you put in your bid, you win the bid, and all of a sudden, great, it's time to award, and you can't show that you're in compliance, either whatever the contract says, right? If it's in a level 1 or a level 2, right? If you can't show compliance, you're not going to get that award. So I mean, that's huge. That's a huge impact to your business there. But on the legal side, if you, again, going back to this idea, if you can get past that and you show, okay, now I'm in the contract or I have an existing contract and this is added to it, and the government finds out that you're not in compliance, I mean, it's going to be, they have a lot of tools, and I discussed previously that they can go after you with. It just depends on your relationship with that contracting officer, whether or not they're going to let you slide. Under CMMC 2.0, they also allow for plan of action and milestones, PONMs. And if you find yourself, hey, we're not able to get there, that's where you need to try to get your cybersecurity team, like, hey, let's establish this, this plan of action. Let's establish our milestones. You have 180 days to do it, but in the Title 32 regulations, they don't allow POM&As for every aspect of a compliance. So again, you can go there, you can see there's some things that are like, no. You can't have a plan of action to do X, Y, or Z. You have to have that done already. So I think the baseline here is review your contract, see what's in there, and if you're required to comply, you got to comply. Or, as I mentioned before, False Claims Act liability, termination possibilities, not getting a contract renewed, and potential debarment are all things that could occur.
So I want to add something real quick to what
Sure.
Jason just shared, if that's okay. And I want everyone here who's a special defense contractor to think about this, right? We can think of the idea of fear or opportunity, right? Carrot or stick, however, right? And so if you look at this in the perspective of what are the opportunities here, there's pros and cons on every side, right? There's costs involved, and we'll probably get into a little more later. But just know that if you look at this as an opportunity, there could be a lot of good stuff awaiting you down the road.
Great. So if I could shift a little bit to a little bit of a different topic around insider threat. I'd be interested in you guys' thoughts on this, kind of anecdotally and some of the stories that we've had. So we've been deploying our capability for, well over a decade now across commercial clients, across DoD, federal, and Intel clients. And one of the things that we have been, championing for quite some time is really this notion of protecting against insider threats, right? Everyone is concerned about, malicious actors from the outside coming in, but oftentimes your biggest risks are not just from malicious actors internally, but sometimes, frankly, incompetent actors internally, right? And so, both of those are insider threats. Some of the things that we have seen, kind of foundationally, what we're doing is we're looking at every transaction in the file system, right? And so we know who touches which data, where they come from, what their accesses were, what their levels of responsibility are, and we can assess risk on each of those transactions in real time, right? And so what some of the things that allows us to do is to get a really good behavioral understanding of both individual accounts, but also account types. So we know, for instance, that system administrators should be administering the system, not accessing data and accessing files, right? And so we can quickly and very effectively identify a system administrator access to data and either throw alerts or shut that down very quickly, because many of those end up being ways that both incompetent or accidental risks emerge, but also how internal threat actors can escalate to those kind of privileged accounts and cause bigger damage inside the systems. So that's one of the things that we're doing proactively and reactively in the system to prevent some of those things. I'm interested in a CMMC sort of context, and maybe Brian, we'll start with you from a compliance perspective. Where does insider threat and the role of technology fit into the compliance requirements of CMMC specifically? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And the first thing I want to share with you is that it all starts with a business needs to understand what the opportunities and risks are, like I said a second ago. But you also need to know if you have either an internal IT person, IT team, or whether you outsource it to what's called in CMMC speak, an external service provider, you have to understand is that those folks typically do not understand, first of all, contract law. They don't understand compliance, and they may not even understand cybersecurity practices. They may be great IT people, but they're really not good at helping you manage your risk and making sure you're not running afoul of your contract requirements. So I want to begin there. Do not conflate those as being the same. They're just not, okay? And so having a really good strategic plan as far as how you're going to approach your contracts, your requirements, and maybe doing a business impact analysis, maybe doing a risk analysis, making sure that you understand as the business owner, you are the risk owner involved in this, right? And so making sure that you have the proper components, whether that's the tools, techniques, and procedures in place to make sure that you're safeguarding this information and knowing what the costs involved are. And I'll also say, for whatever it's worth, in some cases, especially if you're a very, very small organization who maybe has a little bit of DoD work, the cost to bear to become compliant, especially for maturity level 2, can be quite high in relation to your actual receivables, and then kind of slimming it down to your margin, right? Your actual, what you're making, your profit on that contract. So I can go deeper than this, but I want to keep it fairly high level and make sure that people understand. Work with the right people, whether it's with a firm like ours, like Exceed Cyber, or someone else that does what we do, whoever it is. Just consult with somebody to make sure you understand what your requirements are, what it takes to get there, whether you have to create a gap assessment to kind of begin to sort of know where we are today, where to begin, or, look, we don't have anything. We got to build out a compliance program and we got to get going, right? Because this thing is not going to get pushed off. A lot of folks thought this was not going to happen because it took so long to actually mature or to materialize, but it's here. And the reality is you got to get cooking.
So that's a good point. Jason, maybe I'll ask you kind of a follow-up on that. A lot of small and mid-sized companies in the DIB, across the DIB, really outsource a lot of their IT responsibilities, right? Because they either don't have the skill sets, or don't have the infrastructure to do that, right? And the cloud solves everything these days, right? So
Yeah.
Of course.
Well, I'm assuming legally, it's the company signing that contract. They can't just throw up their hands and it's like, oh, well, it's my MSP that had responsibility over that, right? I mean, that's,
Yeah.
so that the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, in an insider threat sort of environment, you have an insider who does either something maliciously or incompetently. It's still ultimately the company that is going to be held responsible by the contracting organization. Am I correct on those assumptions?
Yeah, you're correct. So regardless if you outsource your IT, you as the contractor that has the contract with the government, right? Or if you're a subcontractor lower down on like a tier, but you're still responsible for your cybersecurity program. I want to talk a little bit about reporting requirements, because again, if you go back, you look at 7012 in your contract, whether it's an outside entity or an insider threat, you have a requirement to report cyber incidents. And I think that is something that also came out of, as Brian mentioned, that IG study back in 2019. They found that there were, in that study, there were cyber issues that occurred, but nobody wanted to let DoD know, and DoD got upset about that, right? So now you have to rapidly report, which is defined as 72 hours, issues, right? That I'm going to read off here, that affect a covered contractor information system. So this would be your system that has the CUI, covered defense information residing on a covered contractor information system, right? So again, you're looking at something. Did this affect that information? And if that insider did something to affect that information or affect the system itself, you're supposed to rapidly report that. Now, there could be a lot of ramifications of doing that. I think it's important that you have a good cybersecurity individual, to help you out with making those reports. You probably also may need to contact, your legal advisor to see, hey, like, we're about to make a report to the DoD about an insider threat. What the heck should we do here? Obviously, you've got to take some steps in your own company if you have a incompetent or malignant employee, right? And there's definitely some employment law flavor to that. But yeah, that I would say, like, you've got to, you're not gonna, I mean, I think the thing is, what I'd say is, and Brian and Jeremy, you probably know this better than I do, you're not gonna be able to stop everything, right? There's gonna be bad actors out there that are gonna try to do something. So the idea is, okay, what is my requirements per the contract? You go back to DFAR 7012 to see, hey, what am I supposed to do in the event something like this happens? And you make sure you get those reports done, and then you try to do damage control with your business as far as, hey, either patching that issue through some sort of hardware or software or program solution, and make sure that you don't upset the DoD by not reporting the information.
So I'm
Sure. So
kind of curious if I
Go ahead,
might
Mike.
add on to that. I'm kind of wondering, this would be probably a really good question for Jeremy. So Jeremy, what are some of the key technology requirements that you should implement for data protection? I mean, again, talking about the technical side of it, what would you recommend that look like? It's a broad question, but probably intentionally so.
Yeah, that's good. What strikes me kind of in this whole dialogue that we're talking about right now is, oftentimes, enterprises and IT organizations take a kind of a castle and moat sort of approach to security, right? And you hear more and more about, more robust multi-factor authentication, more robust, network security, and, getting threat intelligence feeds from outside looking in, all of those sorts of things, which are all very important, right? But in an insider threat sort of environment, or in an environment where an adversary has stolen credentials, those things don't effectively prevent those accesses, right? And so, if you're reliant completely on the moat to protect your crown jewels, then once somebody gets across that bridge and into your castle, you really don't even have visibility of what they've done, and right, and so one of the things that we do and we think is really important is to bring that security all the way down right to your data, right to the file system, so that you can't get around it, right? You can't, elevate to a privileged access, right, and do things in the file system because you're privileged, right? Without somebody knowing about it, right? Without the system detecting, alerting, logging, all of those things, right? And without those kinds of technologies right at the file system, then you're blind to what happened after the fact. And Jason just mentioned things about reporting what has occurred, right? Take the go all the way back to Edward Snowden. You go back to the Air National Guard airman up in Massachusetts that was providing classified information on his Discord channel, those sorts of things. you know After those events occurred, which is a sad state anyways, but after those events occurred, they knew a breach occurred, right? And for the documents that they recovered, they knew those documents had been breached. But they really don't have a mechanism to be able to go back and assess really what that individual, what they actually accessed during those times, right? They know what he had access to, but they don't know what he actually accessed. And so I think those are some of the important things that people really need to start looking at is, what is the auditability of your system? What is the fidelity of the information that you have at the data layer, right, in the file system to really know, post-event, what actually occurred, what data was actually affected, where it went, and who took it. But even better, right, something that has some active defensive measures in that data plane that can detect and take action and actively stop those, so you can prevent the loss from the very beginning.
So let me ask you, it's kind of a quick follow on here, because this is because again, being a technologist as well and having that background, I'm curious, how does zero trust architecture kind of work into with compliance with CMMC, and how would you talk about that to our audience?
Yeah, so frankly speaking, RackTop and our founders have been doing zero trust before zero trust really became a word, right? It became a buzzword, right? And our thought process on zero trust and linking to CMMC and other compliance requirements is that we are taking that zero trust implementation all the way down to the data transaction level, right? And so we're looking at every time somebody is transacting in the file system, we're going to challenge that trust, right? We're going to understand where that's coming from, right? What IP address it's coming from, what part of the network it's coming from, what the account it's coming from, what time of the day it's happening, right? All of these things tell our AI engines, hey, is this something that's outside of what we have determined as normal from any of those aspects, right? And if it is, then let's throw an alert. And if it's not, let's log it, right? So every single thing that happens with your data, is logged and is searchable and auditable and reportable after the fact. And I think that's where the two things line up, right? Zero trust is really more of a philosophical approach to life than it is really a technical implementation, right? Because it's going to evolve over time as technologies change, as speeds and bandwidths change. And so that's kind of our approach, and that's what we would recommend for folks is that when you go down that zero trust path, that does help you along the way in compliance of these other scenarios, but you also need to have other experts to come and look at what those gaps are, because I'm sure that there are gaps that technology implementation of zero trust doesn't account for in the reporting and auditability pieces of some of these other technology.
mean, it's good to know. I mean, clearly, I mean, RackTop, you guys have it really dialed in. Again, the nuanced components of what you do and having being able to track, I mean, let's just use one word, track everything. And the auditability, reportability, I think is so critical for our audience to understand here that those mechanisms are super important, right? Because who accessed what? Do you know who did it when, right?
Yeah.
Prime examples.
Yeah, exactly. So and
Yeah.
that was kind of a question I had, and I don't know if this is a legal or compliance question, but I'll start with the legal aspect of it. Let's say an event occurred and you're not able to report with any kind of real fidelity of what happened, who did it, those sorts of things. What kind of legal risk does that put on a company when you can't provide the fidelity of reporting?
Yeah, and I was going to go back to the kind of your previous comment there that 7012 require, it's like, hey, you're supposed to conduct a review for evidence of this compromised information, right? So the idea that that DoD is kind of telling you like you need to have somewhere where we can see like, hey, was the CUI and what particular CUI was actually accessed. Now the ramifications are if your system is inadequate to do so, the DoD is going to say, well, we need to take a look at your system, right? And again, when they start, when they open up the hood, are they going to like what they see, right? And if there were things that you said you were doing that you weren't, you could get in some hot water there. If again, like I said, data breaches, things are going to happen. You're not going to be able to prevent all of them, but the idea being you're a partner with the DoD, they're giving you this information, they are asking you to safeguard it in a particular way, and if you're not following that, the DoD is going to say, okay, well, we're gonna use some of the remedies we have available to us, and one of them could be to again, do a debarment action. Say you can no longer be a federal government contractor for a period of 3 years, right? I mean, it's an administrative determination. It lasts for 3 years, and you're barred across. It's all of government, all agencies, right? So it's not like, oh, I'm just going to be barred from DoD. It goes everywhere, and that obviously it's a killer, right? If you hit that, and that's your business as being a federal government contractor, you're out for 3 years, right? They can debar your company, they can debar particular individuals, and sometimes they do both, right? To make sure that you just don't prop something else up and go back through and try to play again. So yeah, I think the big thing here is if you're not able to provide that evidence, the government's they're gonna ask probably to see what's under the hood. They're gonna look through, they're gonna do their own investigation, their own audit. And again, if you had everything lined up and it was just someone really hid their tracks, you did the best you could. Okay, DoD is going to be okay. Well, they should come to the same conclusion. But if you were lacking in some way, that's going to come back and that could impact you in the ways we've discussed before.
Brian, on the certification side, I'm curious, is this one of those things where you go through the certification and you get the nice gold embossed labeled cert that you frame and put up on your wall and you're done and you're good forever? Or is, there's something that happens that some kind of maintenance you got to do, over time?
Jeremy, I thought you never ask. So no, I mean, all joking aside, the reality is that just let's talk for a second about certification. So let's assume you've implemented the 110 controls we talked about earlier that are required already under DFAR 7012. Don't wait for CMMC to drop. You're already required to do it. If you have CUI, if you got CUI, you got to have it done already. CMMC is the attestation, is the actual confirmation that you did it. Okay. So let's assume you did all that and you're now ready. Like, we got our ducks in a row. We have our system security plan. We have all our controls in place. We have our policies nailed down, good processes, good systems. We think we're ready for audit. Now you have to engage what's called a certified third-party assessment organization called a C3PAO. That is not R2D2's friend. That is someone who comes in, that hangs out with you for a few days, charges you a whole bunch of money, and that says, well, based on everything you said you did, we will give you a certification, right? Essentially, that is a certification of an agent of the DoD. They're officially vetted by the DoD to do that. There's not many of them, at least not yet. So be aware of that. Now, when that happens, that certification is good for 3 years. 3 years. That's it. If you continue to have protect CUI and you have this contract requirements, you have to renew and do another certification audit, right? What they call a certification assessment by C3PAO in another 3 years. But you also have to attest annually that those things are still true and their systems are still being maintained as you claimed in the previous year. Okay, so there's an annual attestation and there's a 3-year certification path.
Great. Yeah, Jason, for those compliance checks, what sort of legally, what sort of things do companies need to be thinking about, as they're approaching those deadlines and they're renewing, option years for contracts, they're, bidding on new contracts. You mentioned before that, you have to have some of these certifications and some of this compliance done, at award. So how does that affect things like renewals and option years and as you're approaching some of those, timelines and deadlines?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the idea again, what does the clause say in the contract? And it says, hey, you'll do your certification assessment, triannually every 3 years, and you will do your annual, attestation, like, hey, we still have this in place. If you fail to do so, right, the government's not supposed to give you, not supposed to exercise an option. So those are things, right? I think of this as, okay, this is something that could highly impact your business, something you need to be watching for. I mean, what's so crazy to me is that we see this, in like the bid protest realm a lot, where folks have let their SAM registration lapse. And even if it's for a day, there's a particular clause in most contracts that says if you let it lapse even for a day, you're no longer eligible for award. And I'm always surprised by the number of times that comes up as a protest issue. Same here, right? This is something you really need to watch for, because is it going to be that you're going to be like, oh, hey, my last certification ended, it was good through October 10th. Okay, it's October 9th. Let me go ahead and try to get this done. Are the systems that you have to go through and enter it, are they going to be online? Are they going to say that you've completed your aspects on time? Maybe not. So this is something that I think you need to put a little bit of emphasis on to get those done almost ahead of time, to make sure that you're not missing anything, right? You got to plan for these things. If you don't meet it, right? So if you're in a current contract and you fail to do that, you're not the contract officer is not supposed to renew your contract. If you fail to do so, if that lapses, right? Again, going back to the False Claims Act issue, and you're signing an invoice saying, hey, government, pay me. I did all the things I was supposed to do, yet you didn't do this. Again, sometimes it feels like that's very minor, but still that could be an issue that the government could be like, wait a second, you let this lapse for 6 months. You didn't do your annual self-assessment and you asked for payment for these 6 months. They're not going to be very happy with that, right? And again, we talked about the remedies that they can go through. It could just be that they slap you on the wrist and let it go, but it could be like they might have serious issues with that. So,
And they can
again,
use that as a reason for, other, either
right.
poor or underperformance in other areas. So kind of as a follow-up to that one, what about the legal responsibilities of prime contractors versus subcontractors and in kind of in this space, and who's responsible for it and who actually gets the the punishment related
Yeah.
to it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because if you look at the Title 32 regulation, so right now the final proposed new 7021, DFAR 7021, that discusses the CMMC, it says you will flow this down to every tier that it needs in accordance with Title 32, Section 170, which is the CMMC rules. Those rules state that, hey, if your subcontractor, say you're the prime, if your subcontractor is going to have FCI, which I think almost every subcontractor will, they're going to have to be CMMC level 1, certified. If they're going to have CUI, they got to be level 2 certified, right? And and so forth. And they say it for level 3, but like as Brian mentioned, there's not going to be too many subs down there that are going to be getting the level 3, needing level 3. That subcontractor, then this is a key point for subcontracts that you have within as a prime. You've got to make sure that subcontract is tight on the language that you're requiring them to do so. And then you got to think about, okay, can I comply with my requirements under the prime contract if I don't have a certification from my sub, right? So that's something where you're going to need to maybe even give the subcontractors a shorter time frame to say, hey, I know that the CMMC says you've got to do this annually, but I need your certification at month 11 so I can make sure I'm good to go when I'm certifying at my 1-year mark, right? So that you got to have tight subcontract language on this issue. You can flow it down, but simply flowing it down, is that going to be enough for you, right? Do you want to have, some warrants and representations in your contract to say that you are specifically warranting and representing that the subcontractor is going to comply with this? That way, if there is a breach, do you want to have liquidated damages in there? Because if the subcontractor mess up, guess what? The government's going after the prime. You, as the prime, could then go after the sub, but you want to make sure that you have everything that you need, right, to lock that up. And that's another thing, is that if you're working, and as Brian mentioned earlier, think about this from the context of not versus, the carrot versus the stick. Imagine how many people, if they don't have this ready to go, the pool of available subcontractors is going to shrink, shrink, shrink. So again, there could be a lot of opportunity out there, but again, as I think we've discussed, there's a lot of, I guess, compliance and setting up and all the things you got to do, the 110 requirements to get there. But yeah, it is going to be big, and primes need to watch their subs. Subs need to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. There's going to be a lot of people out there that need these services to get ready for this. But again, I would say you as the prime, you need to have a good subcontract on this going forward.
Brian, from, and this is, really from small business to medium-sized businesses, from primes to subs, what are some of the common mistakes that companies make when they're trying to, get ready for or get through the compliance pieces? Is there something that, as they're trying to achieve CMMC certification, that they can be doing now, and some of the mistakes they can be avoiding leading up to these things?
Yeah, again, like I mentioned earlier, the first thing that you want to be clear about is that there's a lot you can do, right? Let's say you have an internal IT person to implement certain controls, right, that are in the NIST 800 171 or 171A, which is the actual implementation, and that's how they tell you how to do it. That's the process to implement those controls, and getting closer to 110, right? It's like with anything. How do you eat an elephant? Well, it's one bite at a time. You got to start somewhere. And so having that, first of all, that mentality of, first of all, of cybersecurity, protecting the government's data is crucial. It's paramount to the mission, right? If you're working with the DoD, that's what the DoD cares about. Remember that. That's core to it. So as long as you're following that process and moving toward eventually, like saying, look, we're getting closer to 110. Now we're there. Okay, now we can tell the government we're done and get certified. I want to just really quickly, it's related, but I want to pivot into another conversation that's tied to this. And that is the following. If you're using an outsourced IT service provider, what's usually called an MSP or managed service provider, in the CMMC space, it's called an ESP, an external service provider. That's what they call it. You have to be aware, if you have to be maturity level 2 certified, so do they. Your IT company must be as well. Please take that home with you, okay? If you're here, use an outside IT service company. If you're CMMC maturity level 2, they have to be too. And all the trappings and processes that come with that. And that is a heavy, heavy lift for a lot of IT companies. So please be aware you're knowledgeable, and have conversations and open and honest discussions with those folks who support you, the external providers.
Great. So we're, about 6 minutes from the end of the session. So I kind of wanted to open up kind of in general to the panelists and see, is there anything else that you guys wanted to hit today across your areas that that you think is important before we wrap up? Brian, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so like I said just a minute ago, start somewhere. Start with an understanding. First of all, review your contracts. Jason mentioned it before. You really need to understand what's in your contracts. Secondly, again, look at the opportunity for what it is. Again, Jason touched on it as well, which is understand that if you don't do the requirements, you're going to get hit with a pretty hard stick. You'd be kicked out from doing DoD work or government work in general, perhaps forever, right? It could be the death knell for you. Understanding what that is. So that's on the stick side, right? But again, the opportunities are myriad, because there are going to be so many folks who just don't know. There's ignorance. There's a lack of belief that this is going to happen. A lot of folks are sitting by the sidelines saying, yeah, we heard about CMMC, but we don't think it's going to happen. Or whoever's going to be in office next time is going to turn, or whatever. I mean, there's all these assumptions going forward. This national security is not a what's the word I'm looking for? Agreed to on both sides. The word's escaping me. Anyway, so whether you're left, right, or in the middle, everyone agrees that national security and protecting our information and not having our adversaries eat our lunch is important. This is moving forward, okay? Whether the implementation takes a little bit longer, that's another story. but see the opportunity for what it is. Lean into that and saying, if I can go through this and qualify, a lot of my contemporaries, competitors will not. So I can win. I can be awarded that contract and they can't. As far as compliance goes, start somewhere. If you want to talk to a firm like ours, have that conversation. Hey, we don't know where to start. A company like ours, again, a cybersecurity and compliance firm, can help with that journey.
Great. Jason, final thoughts?
Yeah, I just got to echo those comments and say, yeah, you got to read your contracts, know what's in your contracts, even if it's not, a prime contract with government, but your subcontracts. And then going forward, I talk about sometimes the risk of just like, oh, I'm just going to recycle this old subcontract or this teaming agreement or this JV agreement. Those things are going to be changed, right? You're going to have to, there's new language that's going to need to be inserted into that. And so there's a risk of just kind of recycling what you've already got. And if you're not sure if you've got a contract that's going to protect you, right, either as a prime or the sub, um, you know, go get with your legal counsel. You can obviously contact me if you want me to take a look to see what you've got and if you need to update that. But the other thing is, yeah, with the prime contracts, make sure you're looking at it and make sure you're in compliance. If you feel like there's something, okay, hey, I don't know if I'm in compliance. If you come to me, I'm going to say, well, I'm going to send you over to a Jeremy or a Brian to be like, okay, review what's going on here. And typically my advice would be get in compliance as soon as possible if you're not in compliance and your contract requires it. So, that really is the bottom line here from the legal side, is understanding what's in your contract and complying with it.
Great.
And for Jeremy, how about you? Final thoughts?
Yeah, I think from a technology perspective, the castle and moat approach is no longer adequate, right? You should have a good moat, right? You should protect the edges of your environment with everything you can, right? You can keep people out. That's certainly important. But adversaries are too robust. They're too competent. There are too many ways to get through that outer edge. Likewise with backups, you should have a really robust backup approach and plan. Also not adequate for things like ransomware and especially data theft, right? It helps you to roll back to where you were, but your data is still gone in those scenarios. So I would challenge people to ask your vendors, how do you prevent data from being stolen from my environment, right? If an insider or an adversary is inside my gates, how are you preventing actively and without my intervention from your data being stolen, right? Those are the things that we would be focused on from a technology perspective. And I think those are things that you and your enterprises deserve. Finally here, I'm just going to throw up a contact sheet for folks to look at the end of the recording, and for folks that are still on. Thank you for participating today. We appreciate your time. Hopefully this format and this dialogue was an engaging way to approach something that gets pretty complex and challenging in the implementation stage. But hopefully you came across and came away from this with a little bit more knowledge and a little bit more understanding. We hope that we hear from you, and we look forward to engaging you on this topic and others moving forward. Thanks a lot. And
I'm going to
thanks
say
to the
officially
panelists.
thank you,
Appreciate
Jeremy,
it.
for hosting, for bringing us
Certainly.
together.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, guys.